Something was already here long before the Celts arrived in Britain. Something older, stranger, and far more sophisticated than anyone in the ancient world was ever prepared to admit.
When the Romans finally pushed their legions across the Channel and stood for the first time on British soil, they did not find a simple island of painted barbarians. They found ruins they simply could not explain.
Earthworks that entirely defied their engineering logic. Astronomical alignments so exact they made Roman mathematicians profoundly uncomfortable. And a memory carried in the mouths of the oldest locals that pointed to a civilization so ancient it had already become legend before Julius Caesar was even born. This is the story they did not teach you in school.
This is the story of the people who inhabited Britain before everyone we think of as ancient, before the Celts who fascinated the Romans, before the Bell Beaker migrants who swept across Europe in the 3rd millennium BCE, before even the Neolithic farmers who erected the first stone monuments on the British landscape.
There were people deeply rooted in this island whose bones, monuments, and astronomical genius persisted through every invasion, every demographic replacement, and every catastrophe for thousands of years. What they built was so extraordinary that the most powerful empire the Western world had ever produced looked at the remains and felt something dangerously close to fear.
Before we dive deeper into the hidden history of Britain and the ancient world, take a second and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. It genuinely means a lot to see how far these stories travel. And if you want more deep dives, hit like and subscribe so you never miss one.
The island of Britain sits at the northwestern edge of the European continent, separated from the mainland by a channel that was not always there. For most of human prehistory, Britain was a peninsula, a cold, windswept extension of a vast landmass stretching from the Atlantic coast to the steppes of Central Asia.
That land bridge connecting Britain to what is now the Netherlands and Denmark was known as Doggerland. It was home to some of the earliest communities of anatomically modern humans in northwestern Europe. And let's be clear, these were not primitive cave dwellers scraping at flint in the dark.
They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers. They understood the movement of animals, the cycles of rivers, the patterns of seasons, and the slow shifting of a landscape still recovering from the last great ice age. They crafted tools of extraordinary refinement and moved through a vast system of forests and marshes that the sea has long since swallowed.
Around 9,000 years ago, melting ice raised sea levels dramatically, flooding Doggerland. The communities living on that peninsula were forced to retreat. Some moved west onto the higher ground of what would become the British Isles. By around 6500 BCE, Britain was an island, cutting off its inhabitants from the continent. What happened to them in that isolation over the next few millennia is one of the most extraordinary stories in human prehistory.
The Mesolithic people of Britain, the hunter-gatherers who lived here before farming arrived, left behind a world that archaeology is only just beginning to grasp. At Star Carr in North Yorkshire, excavations have revealed a site of unimaginable richness. Over 10,000 years ago, people were living there in organized ways that shatter every assumption about so-called primitive pre-agricultural societies.
They built timber platforms at the edge of a lake. They crafted headdresses from red deer skulls, carefully perforated to be worn, suggesting highly complex ritual practices. They designed specific bone and antler tools for hunting. But most importantly, they returned to the exact same site repeatedly over hundreds of years. This implies a deep territorial attachment and an advanced grasp of seasonal geography.
This requires cognitive mapping. It means they knew where they were going before they went there, understanding the relationship between their current location and other places across a vast landscape. They made long-term decisions about resource use. This is the behavior of people with culture, tradition, and accumulated generational knowledge.
Star Carr isn't an anomaly. At Howick in Northumberland, we see evidence of a substantial circular structure built around 7700 BCE, making it one of the earliest known permanent structures in Britain. At Thatcham in Berkshire, we find repeated occupation and organized tool manufacture. These people were the direct ancestors of something that would erupt onto the British landscape with dramatic force around 6,000 years ago.
The Neolithic Revolution reached Britain around 4000 BCE. Farming was brought in by migrants from continental Europe, but the genetic evidence from ancient DNA tells a genuinely strange story about what happened when these incoming farmers met the indigenous hunter-gatherers.
In most of Europe, the Neolithic transition is a story of total genetic replacement. But in Britain, genuine mixing occurred. The resulting population was a true hybrid. Crucially, they carried forward a relationship with the land that the indigenous Britons had cultivated for thousands of years.
When the incoming farmers encountered this existing framework of sacred rivers, specific hills, and ancient rituals, they didn't override it. They absorbed it, adapted it, and built upon it to produce the most spectacular monumental landscape in the prehistoric world.
The megalithic tradition of Britain and Ireland is completely unique. Enormous stones weighing dozens of tons were arranged with precision across a landscape stretching from Cornwall to the Scottish Islands. These were not accidental geological formations. They were the product of deliberate, sustained human effort over centuries, meant to endure for millennia.
The long barrows of Britain, like Wayland's Smithy, West Kennet, and the Cotswold Severn tombs, are the foundation of this tradition. They were collective burial chambers designed to house the disarticulated bones of entire communities. The bones were not forgotten. They were actively managed, rearranged, and used in continuous rituals.
West Kennet Long Barrow in Wiltshire was built around 3500 BCE and was actively used for burials and rituals for over 1,000 years. 1,000 years of institutional memory. To put that in perspective, 1,000 years ago from today takes us back before the Norman conquest. Maintaining continuous practice across a span equivalent to the distance between us and the Battle of Hastings speaks to a staggering capacity for cultural continuity.
From this long barrow tradition emerged the Henge monuments, and at the center of this terrifying, inexplicable genius stands Stonehenge. Familiarity has dulled our astonishment, but strip that away and the shock returns. Stonehenge evolved over 1,500 years, beginning around 3000 BCE as an earthwork with cremation burials, proving its immediate connection to ancestral memory.
Then, around 2500 BCE, the massive stones arrived. First, the blue stones, 80 pillars sourced from the Presley's Hills in Wales, 250 miles away. Moving stones weighing up to 4 tons across rivers, bogs, and sea inlets required coordinating the labor of thousands over decades. It completely shatters the standard narrative of small, independent farming communities.
And then came the sarsen stones, the iconic horseshoe of massive trilithons, weighing up to 25 tons, sourced from the Marlborough Downs. The lintels were shaped and fitted using mortise and tenon joints, woodworking techniques applied to monumental stone construction.
Beyond the engineering is the astronomy. Stonehenge aligns precisely with the summer solstice, sunrise, and winter solstice sunset. It even encodes the 18.6-year lunar cycle. This isn't primitive guesswork. This is observational astronomy, mathematical prediction, and architectural engineering executed in stone.
Just a few miles north lies Avebury, the largest stone circle in the world, enclosing 11 hectares. Its massive outer ditch was dug 10 meters deep into solid chalk bedrock, removing an estimated 200,000 tons of material using only antler picks and shoulder blade shovels. Avebury sits at the center of a deliberately constructed ceremonial geography encompassing West Kennet, the Avenues, and Silbury Hill.
Silbury Hill is perhaps the most mysterious. Rising 37 meters above the landscape, it's the largest prehistoric mound in Europe. Built around 2400 BCE, it features a highly sophisticated concentric structural engineering design. Yet despite centuries of excavation, no burial or central deposit has ever been found. Its purpose remains a total enigma.
The megalithic civilization extended far into Scotland. The ring of Brodgar in Orkney sits within an exceptional henge, aligned with complex astronomical events. Nearby, the Ness of Brodgar has completely transformed our understanding of Neolithic Britain.
Discovered in 2003, the Ness features massive, elaborately constructed stone buildings showing evidence of vast regional feasting. It also houses geometric incised stonework, representing one of Britain's earliest traditions of abstract art, a shared symbolic vocabulary spanning the Orcadian Neolithic world.
Further west, Callanish on the Isle of Lewis features a unique cruciform stone circle dating to 2900 BCE. Its geometry is perfectly arranged to frame the major lunar standstill, an astronomical event occurring only once every 18.6 years. This required centuries of sustained celestial observation.
So, looking at this staggering scale of engineering, astronomy, and unified cultural purpose spanning the entire island, we are forced to face the exact question that haunted the Roman historian Tacitus.
Who were these people?
It's the question that fundamentally breaks the timeline we've been handed. We are looking at over 2,000 years of sustained, coordinated civilization. We're talking about political organizations capable of mobilizing thousands of laborers, economic systems supporting massive extraction projects like Silbury Hill, and knowledge systems capable of calculating lunar standstills. Yet they left no written records. How do you reconcile that silence with the sheer volume of their achievements?
You have to look at how history was constructed to understand why this civilization was erased. When the Victorians systematized the study of prehistoric Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were operating under a rigid framework of human progress. To them, civilization moved strictly in a straight line from primitive savagery to classical enlightenment.
Exactly. The Victorians looked at Stonehenge, they looked at Avebury, and their worldview couldn't process it. They saw the mathematical precision and the colossal engineering, and they immediately attributed it to outside influences. To them, it had to be a lost race, divine intervention, or wandering Mediterranean architects. The idea that indigenous Britons, the direct descendants of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, could have built this from their own intellectual resources was utterly unthinkable.
Because admitting that indigenous people built it would destroy the justification for their own empire. The Victorian model required a narrative where civilized empires brought light to primitive barbarians, acknowledging that the ancient Britons had mastered structural engineering, complex mortise and tenon stonework, and observational astronomy millennia before Rome even existed, would have inverted their entire civilizational hierarchy.
Which is why the narrative of a primitive pre-Roman Britain persisted for so long. They classified these people as not quite fully human in their cognitive abilities. They couldn't accept that these builders had an institutional memory stretching back thousands of years. Just look at the cognitive dissonance required to stand inside the ditch at Avebury, staring at a 200,000-ton chalk excavation achieved with antler picks, and call the people who organized it primitive.
It is intellectual arrogance in its purest form, and it wasn't just the Victorians. The Roman sources before them suffered from a similar blind spot. They encountered a society living without grid-planned cities or written literature, and they equated that absence with ignorance. Yet, they found themselves completely terrified by the ancient, embedded authority of the landscape they were trying to conquer.
Because the landscape itself was the record. The knowledge wasn't missing, it just wasn't written on parchment. It was inscribed into the earth, encoded into the alignment of stones at Callanish, mapped into the sightlines of the Cotswold Long Barrows. The Victorians and the Romans before them simply lacked the literacy required to read a landscape as a primary document.
But the evidence can no longer be ignored. The modern archaeological record, the radiocarbon dating, the environmental data, the sheer irrefutable physical presence of the monuments, demands that we tear down that old framework. We are forced to think the unthinkable now.
We have to accept that a sophisticated, intellectually serious civilization evolved entirely on its own, right here in the isolation of this island. They possessed a deep scientific knowledge expressed in the only medium available to them at the time.
Stone. And that is a truth we have to finally confront, because the evidence demands it. The Bell Beaker phenomenon, which swept across Europe from roughly 2500 BCE, brought a demographic shift to Britain so profound and sudden that it forces us to reconsider the very nature of conquest, migration, and cultural survival. Modern ancient DNA studies, particularly the groundbreaking genetic analyses published in the journal Nature in 2018, delivered a shock to the archaeological establishment. They revealed that the arrival of these Bell Beaker migrants was associated with an almost total genetic replacement of the existing British population. Estimates drawn from this genetic data suggest that over the course of just a few hundred years, the indigenous population of Britain was replaced by around 90%. The incoming migrants arriving from the continent were primarily descended from the Yamnaya populations of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. These steppe nomads had already pushed westward, mixing with European farmer populations in Central Europe before they crossed the Channel. They brought with them new physical traits, new genetic markers, and new biological adaptations. One of the most striking biological inheritances they brought was lactase persistence, the genetic mutation allowing adults to digest raw animal milk. This single adaptation, born of the vast pastoral horizons of the Eurasian steppe, became near universal in the British population after the Beaker transition, laying the deep genetic foundations for why dairy farming has remained so incredibly central to the British agricultural economy ever since. We are looking at a population replacement of an extraordinary, almost unfathomable scale. In purely biological terms, the people who had engineered the early earthworks, the people who had dragged the first stones to Avebury, and the people who had begun the grand project of Stonehenge were almost completely erased and replaced by the people who eventually finished building it. But here is the crucial history-altering point. The replacement was overwhelmingly genetic, not cultural. When we look at the archaeological record of this period, we do not see the hallmarks of a culture bent on wiping out the memory of its predecessors. The Beaker people who arrived on the shores of Britain did not tear down Stonehenge. They did not fill in the massive, labor-intensive chalk ditches of Avebury. They did not flatten Silbury Hill. Instead, they adopted these monuments. They continued to use them, to add to them, and to participate in the ancient, deeply rooted ritual landscape that the previous genetically distinct population had spent millennia creating. The astronomical knowledge, the seasonal ceremonial practices, the alignment with the solstices, and the profoundly complex symbolic frameworks embedded in the megalithic landscape were taken up by this incoming population with what appears to have been remarkably little resistance. Why would a newly dominant, demographically overwhelming population adopt the sacred architecture of the people they were replacing? The answers point to the sheer overwhelming power of the megalithic civilization. It is entirely possible that the incoming migrants encountered the existing monuments as a staggering fait accompli, physical expressions of a localized power, engineering genius, and astronomical knowledge so palpable and undeniable that they simply could not be dismissed, ignored, or destroyed. It is also highly probable that the existing indigenous population, though demographically overwhelmed and fading from the genetic record, still contained individuals holding the sacred and technical knowledge of the monuments. These individuals, the astronomers, the master engineers, the spiritual memory keepers, may have been actively absorbed into the new social order. Their expertise in predicting the movements of the sky and maintaining the sacred geography of the island was simply too valuable to discard. Ultimately, the monuments themselves were so obviously, undeniably impressive that they commanded absolute respect from anyone who encountered them, regardless of their cultural origins or genetic background. The megaliths forced the newcomers to submit to the landscape, rather than forcing the landscape to submit to them. As this new, genetically transformed population settled in, the Bronze Age civilization that emerged in Britain from the Bell Beaker transition proved to be remarkable in its own right, developing levels of wealth and technical sophistication that challenge everything we assume about prehistoric life. To understand the wealth and mobility of this era, we need only look at the Amesbury Archer. Discovered near Stonehenge and dating to around 2300 BCE, his grave provides a stunning, unparalleled window into the interconnected world of this period. The Amesbury Archer's grave contained over 100 objects, making it the richest Bell Beaker burial ever found anywhere in Europe. He was interred with copper knives, exquisite gold hair ornaments, flint tools of exceptional, almost decorative quality, fine pottery vessels, and stone wrist guards used by elite archers. But the most astonishing revelation came from the chemical analysis of his teeth. The isotopic signatures locked in his tooth enamel proved that this man did not grow up in the chalk downlands of Wiltshire. He grew up in the Alpine region of Central Europe. He had made a journey of over 1,000 miles across the European continent, across the sea, to reach Britain and ultimately be buried in the immediate shadow of Stonehenge. This man was not just a random wanderer or a desperate migrant. The unprecedented richness of his burial, the sheer quality and quantity of the prestige objects interred with him, and his deliberate proximity to the most important monument in the British sacred landscape suggest he was a person of immense status. He was likely a metalworker or a craftsman of exceptional, almost magical skill in the eyes of his contemporaries. The ability to transform rock into gleaming, lethal metal was the defining technology of the age, and men who held this knowledge were powerful. He may have been a leader, a spiritual figure, or someone with a specific, revered relationship to the monumental center of the British sacred landscape. But the British Bronze Age is not solely a story of wandering elites, prestige goods, and gold hair tresses. It is also the story of a society possessing an extraordinary level of sophistication in its everyday domestic functioning. The site of Must Farm in Cambridgeshire, excavated between 2015 and 2016, has been rightly described as Britain's Bronze Age Pompeii. And let me assure you, that description is not hyperbole. Must Farm was a thriving settlement of large, complex timber roundhouses built on stilts directly over a slow-moving river, dating to around 850 BCE. It was suddenly destroyed by a catastrophic fire, causing the flaming structures and all their contents to collapse directly into the river below. The anaerobic oxygen-free river mud swallowed the settlement, preserving its contents in a state of breathtaking, almost eerie completeness. What the excavators pulled from that mud was a flawless snapshot of everyday Bronze Age life in Britain, captured at a level of detail that archaeology rarely ever achieves. The inhabitants of Must Farm were not scratching out a miserable existence. They ate exceptionally well. Their diet included freshwater fish, wild birds, red deer, domesticated cattle, sheep, and goats. They cultivated and consumed wheat and barley, and foraged for hazelnuts and sloe berries. They cooked their food in sophisticated, finely made pottery vessels, including large cauldrons that could hold substantial quantities of food, pointing clearly to a culture of communal cooking, feasting, and social gathering. They possessed bronze tools and weapons of astonishing variety and metallurgical quality. The mud yielded sickles for harvesting, chisels for fine woodworking, heavy axes for timber felling, and lethal, perfectly cast spearheads. Perhaps most surprisingly, they wore textiles of incredibly fine quality. We are talking about fabrics with thread counts and complex weaving techniques that produced cloth entirely comparable to modern hand-woven linens. They were not wearing crude animal pelts. They were clothed in tailored, finely woven garments. They adorned themselves with glass beads and amber jewelry that had been traded from sources as impossibly distant as the Baltic coast and the Mediterranean. They ate from wooden bowls and platters that were not crudely carved by hand, but turned on a lathe, a woodworking technique requiring an understanding of rotational mechanics and specialized tools, representing a level of craftsmanship that is simply staggering for the period. They maintain their settlement with a standard of construction and architectural planning that reflects a deep, long-standing experience with complex timber engineering in a highly challenging wetland environment. Must Farm reveals a community of people who were fed, clothed, housed, and equipped at a level that no historian in the 18th or 19th century would have ever believed possible for prehistoric Britons. It represents a standard of living and a mastery of material culture that completely obliterates the persistent, insulting image of primitive savages that dominated our cultural imagination for centuries. And the vast trade networks that supplied Must Farm with its Baltic amber and its continental glass beads point to something equally vital for understanding this civilization. Britain in the Bronze Age was absolutely not an isolated, peripheral backwater. It was an integral, central component of a massive continental and pan-European trading system. This system connected the island to communities stretching across Europe, the Mediterranean, and far beyond. The copper, and most importantly, the tin that produced the bronze for the tools and weapons found at Must Farm and every other Bronze Age settlement in Britain, came from Cornwall, Wales, and Ireland. But the finished bronze objects found in Britain also show undeniable stylistic and metallurgical connections to objects manufactured in Denmark, Germany, France, and the Iberian Peninsula. The gold used in the heavy gleaming jewelry of the British Bronze Age came from the streams of Ireland and the deep mines of continental Europe. This means there were specialized classes of people whose entire existence was dedicated to moving these precious materials and finished objects across enormous, dangerous distances. They maintained complex diplomatic and economic relationships between communities separated by treacherous sea crossings and hundreds of miles of untamed land. The tin from Cornwall, in particular, places Britain at the absolute epicenter of one of the most critical trading networks of the ancient Bronze Age world. Bronze requires copper and tin. While copper is relatively common, tin is exceedingly rare in the ancient world. The Cornish tin deposits in the southwest of Britain were among the richest and most significant on the entire European continent. Access to this Cornish tin made Britain a critical, indispensable node in the complex supply chains that kept the grand Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean world functioning, expanding, and arming their militaries. Phoenician traders, the great mariners of the ancient Mediterranean, are believed to have reached the treacherous coasts of Cornwall in the first millennium BCE, and very possibly centuries earlier, specifically to access and control these vital tin supplies. Ancient Greek geographic and historical sources speak in hushed, valuable tones of the Cassiterides, the mythical tin islands, which modern historians generally identify with Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly. The Greek merchant and explorer Pytheas, who undertook a daring voyage to sail around the coast of Britain around 320 BCE, described a highly sophisticated trading economy. He observed an economic system in which tin was mined, refined, and exchanged through a complex chain of local intermediaries, before being shipped across the English Channel, carried overland through Gaul, and finally distributed to the hungry markets of the Mediterranean. Let that sink in. By the time the Romans began seriously contemplating the military conquest of Britain in the 1st century BCE, the island was already deeply embedded in international intercontinental trade networks. These networks directly connected the Britons to the Phoenician world, the Greek world, and through them to the entire Mediterranean civilizational sphere. Britain was not an unknown entity to the ancient empires, it was a known quantity. It was a famous source of specific, highly valuable commodities and a primary destination for the most ambitious long-distance traders in the ancient world. The sheer sophistication of this trading economy did not surprise the Romans. They understood trade. What surprised them, what actively unsettled them, was the physical, undeniable evidence of what the civilization that produced this economy had built upon the landscape. When Julius Caesar launched his initial military expeditions across the Channel in 55 and 54 BCE, the accounts he left behind in his famous commentaries, the Gallic Wars, became the first extended first-person Roman narrative of Britain. Caesar's accounts are endlessly fascinating, but they are fascinating just as much for what he deliberately chooses not to notice as for what he actually describes. Caesar accurately describes the interior of Britain as being inhabited by people he identifies as the original inhabitants. He notes that the coastal and southeastern populations had more recent cultural and genetic connections to the continent, while those deeper inland were of a much greater antiquity. He explicitly notes that the Druids of Gaul, the intellectual and spiritual elite of the Celtic world, regularly traveled to Britain to learn and study. This clearly indicates that Britain was universally regarded by the Celtic peoples as the ancient source, the absolute center, of the Druidic tradition. It was a tradition of high learning and complex philosophy that even a deeply arrogant man like Caesar had to acknowledge as intellectually serious. He describes the British population as vastly numerous, living in a landscape crowded with buildings not unlike those of the Gauls, and possessing enormous herds of cattle. But Caesar never describes Stonehenge. He does not describe the colossal ditches of Avebury. He does not describe the staggering, inexplicable bulk of Silbury Hill, or the Ring of Brodgar, or any of the hundreds of massive megalithic monuments that were perfectly visible, intact, and dominating the British landscape when his legions arrived. This is a deliberate, calculated silence. And in ancient historical sources, deliberate silences are always the most revealing artifacts of all. The most logical explanation is not that Caesar, a meticulous military commander scouting enemy territory, somehow failed to see monuments that are visible from miles away. It is that he simply did not know what to say about them. Or worse, he realized that what he would have to say would be far too disturbing to commit to the official Roman record. Caesar was writing a political document. The Gallic Wars was a piece of high-level propaganda, designed to justify his expensive military campaigns and demonstrate the supremacy of Roman power to the Senate and the citizens back home, acknowledging the physical existence of stone monuments and engineered earthworks that utterly dwarfed anything the Roman Republic had ever built. Structures created by people his audience fully expected to be naked, primitive barbarians, would have been a deeply inconvenient truth. However, the broader Roman and Greek literary tradition surrounding Britain does contain lingering traces of the sheer astonishment that the physical and intellectual reality of the island produced in classical observers. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BCE and drawing on older sources that almost certainly included the lost accounts of Pythias, describes a magnificent circular temple of great size located on a northern island. He notes that the sun god is said to visit this temple precisely every 19 years. This is, without any reasonable doubt, a direct reference to Stonehenge, and the highly specific detail about the 19-year cycle is a direct, undeniable reference to the Metonic cycle. This is the complex astronomical cycle of 18.6 to 19 years, after which the sun and the moon return to the exact same relative positions in the sky. It is the exact same lunar cycle encoded into the stones at Callanish and built into the sightlines of other British megalithic sites. The ancient sources Diodorus relied upon knew perfectly well that this circular temple was a functional astronomical instrument connected to a 19-year celestial cycle, and they recorded it with awe. This proves that the British peoples, or at least their highly trained priestly class, were still actively aware of the profound astronomical significance of their ancient monuments well into the era when Pythias visited around 320 BCE. Pomponius Mela, a Roman geographer writing in the mid-1st century CE, describes the Druids as teaching their initiates in hidden places and caves. This highly specific description may actually preserve a distant Roman memory of the indigenous use of natural caverns, or more likely, artificial chambers like the ancient Neolithic long barrows and passage graves, as sacred, acoustically isolated spaces for the transmission of esoteric knowledge. The Druids are consistently, universally described in classical Roman and Greek sources as possessing an incredibly extensive body of high learning. They held deep knowledge of astronomy, natural philosophy, and a profound theological belief in the transmigration and immortality of souls. This theology struck Roman observers as highly sophisticated, even when they found the associated sacrificial rituals to be barbarically expressed. The Greek geographer Strabo notes with clear respect that the Druids studied both natural and moral philosophy. Cicero, the greatest orator of Rome, personally met a Druid named Diviciacus in the capital. Cicero, a man not easily impressed by provincials, described this Druid as being deeply knowledgeable about augury, the mathematics of the natural world, and the workings of the cosmos. Even Julius Caesar himself, despite his intense political hostility toward the Druids as a unifying force of anti-Roman resistance, openly acknowledges their astonishing intellectual discipline. He reports that Druidic initiates spent up to 20 years memorizing a vast, incredibly complex body of knowledge. A body of knowledge they strictly refused to commit to writing. 20 years. Think about what that means. The training period of a Druid was 20 solid years of rigorous rote oral memorization. This was a body of knowledge so unimaginably massive, so detailed, and so systematically organized that it required an investment of time equal to a modern person's journey from kindergarten through a PhD, programmed just to master it. What exactly was contained within that vast unwritten library of the mind? Caesar tells us directly. He says their teachings concerned the movements of the stars, the immense size of the universe, the geographic nature of the earth, the philosophical nature of things, and the eternal power of the immortal gods. Now, the Roman world obviously had its own highly trained astronomers and brilliant philosophers, so the mere existence of astronomical and philosophical knowledge in Britain was not in itself what terrified them. What truly astonished them, what they struggled so deeply to articulate in their written sources without sounding like they were losing their minds, was the impossible combination they were looking at. Here was a society that appeared, by every standard Roman metric, to utterly lack the conventional markers of advanced civilization. They lived in circular timber roundhouses rather than rectilinear stone cities. They operated entirely without a written literature. They lacked a formal, codified written legal system that was recognizable to Roman eyes. And yet, despite lacking all the trappings of Roman modernity, this society possessed a body of intellectual, astronomical, and spiritual knowledge that was so undeniably profound, it commanded immediate, unfeigned respect from highly educated Romans who encountered it face to face. This Druidic knowledge system was not some sudden, brilliant innovation of the Iron Age Celts who dominate the conventional, simplified picture of pre-Roman Britain. The Druids were the inheritors. They were the living transmitters of something far, far older. They were the custodians of a tradition of learning about the mechanics of the sky, the sacred geometry of the landscape, and the deep spiritual relationship between human communities and the natural world. This tradition had been continuously accumulating on the British Isles since the Neolithic period. The breathtaking astronomical knowledge physically encoded into the megalithic monuments was not lost or forgotten in the thousands of years after those monuments were built. It was seamlessly incorporated into a living, breathing tradition of oral learning. It was kept alive across millennia by the specialist intellectual class that later Roman observers would label the Druids, but which had almost certainly existed under other ancient names and in slightly varying forms for exactly as long as the stone circles themselves. Stop and truly consider the staggering implications of this reality. If Stonehenge was constructed around 2500 BCE, and if the astronomical knowledge it encodes was part of a continuous, unbroken tradition of oral learning that survived all the way to the era of Roman contact in the 1st century BCE, then that tradition had been alive, active, and mathematically accurate for approximately 2,500 years. 2,500 years. That is 25 centuries of accumulated astronomical observation. 25 centuries of refined, tested mathematical understanding. 25 centuries of sustained, highly organized intellectual culture, carried securely and accurately in the meticulously trained memories of a specialist class, passed down through uncountable generations without a single word being written on a page. The tradition of deep learning that the Romans encountered in Britain, which they found simultaneously impressive and existentially threatening, was not a new Celtic development. It was the living, breathing continuation of the exact same intellectual culture that had engineered the colossal monuments the Romans could see, looming on every hillside and chalk plain. This is what genuinely terrified the Romans. It wasn't just the physical monuments themselves, though the sheer scale of stones transported hundreds of miles was impressive enough to give any Roman engineer pause. What terrified them was the creeping, undeniable recognition, a recognition they could not fully articulate because it completely contradicted all their foundational assumptions about the nature of civilization. That the island of Britain had been home to a sophisticated, sustained, intellectually rigorous civilization for thousands of years before the city of Rome had even been founded. It was the terrifying realization that the people they were violently attempting to conquer were not primitive barbarians, stumbling blindly into the glorious light of Roman civilization. They realized that these Britons were, in a very real, tangible sense, the descendants and inheritors of a culture that was vastly older, and in some highly specific ways regarding astronomy and landscape integration, vastly more instructive than Rome itself. And worst of all, for the Roman imperial project, they realized that the knowledge embedded in this ancient British tradition, the precise understanding of the sky, the impossibly long, unbroken memory of the landscape, the deep philosophical frameworks that made profound sense of the relationship between human life and the cosmic order, was not going to be easily erased by the simple arrival of men with iron swords and leather sandals. A civilization that remembers the movements of the stars for 3,000 years does not forget who it is, just because an emperor in Italy declares it conquered. And Rome knew it. They knew they were not facing savages. They were facing the ghosts of a civilization older than their own gods, and those ghosts were very much alive in the minds of the Druids. The pre-Roman Iron Age in Britain, an era stretching from roughly 700 BCE up until the cataclysmic Roman conquest initiated by Emperor Claudius in 43 CE, is the period we most instinctively and universally associate with the Celts. There is absolutely no question that the Iron Age peoples of Britain spoke Celtic languages, embraced Celtic artistic motifs, and actively participated in the broader Celtic cultural sphere of northwestern Europe. They maintained the fierce warrior aristocracies, the complex tribal structures, and the formidable Druidic intellectual class that Roman observers so vividly documented. But the traditional, historically lazy idea that the Celts simply migrated to Britain around 800 BCE and founded a brand new civilization on an empty, primitive, or culturally blank landscape is no longer academically supportable. It is a myth that collapses the moment it is subjected to the weight of modern archaeological evidence. The Celtic cultural forms, the languages, the aesthetics, the political hierarchies, were not dropped onto an empty island. They were adopted by, or perhaps imposed upon, an indigenous population that already possessed several thousand years of intense cultural, intellectual, and spiritual development. Take, for example, the brilliant Latin art style that so famously characterizes the British Iron Age. This is the art of swirling, organic, plant-based motifs, characterized by a breathtaking dynamic tension between hyper-realistic representation and surreal abstraction. It is undeniably spectacular. But this extraordinary metalwork was not merely a foreign importation applied to a passive, neutral British substrate. It was developed in direct, profound interaction with an existing indigenous aesthetic tradition, a tradition that had been producing abstract decoration, complex geometric patterns, and highly sophisticated visual expression for millennia before the Latin style ever crystallized on the continent. When you look at the magnificent iron swords and bronze shields of the British Iron Age warrior aristocracy, you are looking at decorations that contain a deep, ancestral visual logic. If you trace the lineage of those swirling, asymmetrical patterns back far enough, they connect directly to the geometric incisions on Neolithic pottery. They echo the mesmerizing carved spirals of the megalithic passage graves, the mesmerizing hallucinatory patterns on the famous Battersea shield, or the intricate horned Waterloo helmet pulled from the mud of the River Thames are not simply Celtic art painted onto a British canvas. They are the ultimate, mature flowering of a visual tradition that began in the British Neolithic, evolved through the Bell Beaker and Bronze Age periods, and reached its absolute zenith under the influence of continental Celtic forms. The blacksmiths forging these weapons, and the chieftains wielding them, were not simply transplanted continental Celts. They were the biological and cultural descendants of the exact same people who had been developing visual art and manipulating the landscape on this island for 5,000 years. And it was this deeply rooted, heavily layered civilization that truly terrified the Romans. It was not just the individual artifacts, however impressive their metallurgical quality. It was not just the individual stone monuments, however overwhelming their scale. It was the crushing combination of it all. It was the physical, undeniable evidence of a depth of history that made Roman civilization look like a recent, shallow invention. It was the presence of an intellectual tradition that meticulously preserved and transmitted the knowledge encoded in that ancient history. And it was the stubborn, unbreakable persistence of a sacred geography that organized the entire British landscape into a vast, interconnected system of meaning. A system that actively, defiantly resisted Roman redescription. We see this staggering scale of social organization perfectly expressed in the hillforts of Iron Age Britain. Britain possesses more hillforts per square kilometer than anywhere else in Europe, with modern estimates ranging from 3,000 to 4,000 surviving examples scattered across the landscape. These were heavily defended settlements deliberately constructed on commanding hilltops and strategic promontories across the length and breadth of the island. They were surrounded by multiple concentric banks and massively deep ditches that represented truly formidable obstacles to any attacking force. The largest of these defensive earthworks, such as the legendary Maiden Castle in Dorset, are of a scale that borders on the incomprehensible. Maiden Castle occupies a vast area of around 47 acres. It is entirely enclosed within a dizzying labyrinth of multiple banks and chalk-cut ditches that, even after thousands of years of erosion, still reach terrifying heights of over 20 meters in certain places. The outer perimeter of the Maiden Castle earthworks is nearly 3 kilometers long. The sheer, staggering volume of human labor required to excavate those ditches into the solid chalk bedrock, to carry that rubble upward, and to meticulously construct those towering defensive banks was completely comparable to the labor required to build the major Neolithic henges like Avebury, thousands of years earlier. And Maiden Castle is not an isolated anomaly. Hillforts of highly comparable scale, complex engineering, and defensive sophistication are found right across Britain, stretching from the rugged coasts of Cornwall to the windswept hills of Northumberland. When the Romans eventually decided to conquer the island, they found the hillforts of Britain to be formidable, blood-soaked military obstacles. The Roman legions, despite their superior siege engineering, had to fight bitterly for every inch of chalk. The brutal massacre at Maiden Castle, evidenced by the harrowing war cemetery, discovered there by the legendary archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler in the 1930s, perfectly illustrates the terrifying violence that accompanied the Roman assault on these sites. Wheeler's excavations revealed a scene of absolute carnage. The skeletal remains of the British defenders were unearthed with heavy Roman ballista bolts still violently embedded in their spines. The hasty burials in that war cemetery included dozens of individuals displaying catastrophic, fatal injuries inflicted by the heavy blades of Roman gladius swords. But it is crucial to understand that these hillforts were not merely temporary military redoubts or empty castles waiting for a siege. They were thriving, densely populated towns. They were vibrant urban centers of manufacture, trade, agricultural storage, and complex social life. The meticulously excavated interiors of major hillforts reveal hundreds of overlapping roundhouses, massive grain storage pits lined with clay, and extensive evidence of specialized, high-temperature metalworking. We find evidence of large-scale pottery production, intensive textile manufacture, and the full, bustling range of economic activities associated with permanent, highly organized urban settlement. They were the capitals of a civilization that organized itself on spatial principles entirely different from the rigid, rectangular Roman grid, but no less effectively managed. This advanced level of social and economic organization is further proven by the coinage of the British Iron Age, a vital indicator of pre-Roman sophistication that is far too often overlooked or dismissed by classical historians. The independent tribes of Britain began minting their own native coins from around 150 BCE. Initially, these were struck in loose imitation of the gold coins from the Hellenistic Greek world, which had reached Britain through extensive, long-distance trade networks. But very quickly, the British minters developed distinctly native styles that radically departed from their Mediterranean prototypes. They took the standard classical images, the horse, the chariot, the profile of a ruler, and subjected them to a brilliant, deliberate process of artistic deconstruction. The abstract, swirling, sometimes visually bewildering designs of British Iron Age coins break these motifs apart and reassemble them in ways that bear only a loose, dreamlike relationship to realistic representation. They represent a highly deliberate, confident artistic tradition with its own strict internal logic. These coins are not the primitive, incompetent imitations of a classical technology not fully understood, as earlier historians arrogantly assumed. They are sophisticated, intentional, artistic expressions of a uniquely British worldview. It was a worldview in which reality was not fixed, static, and stable, but rather fluid, dynamic, and deeply interconnected. It was a visual language reflecting a cosmos, where the boundary between the human and the animal, the natural and the supernatural, was highly permeable. Beyond their artistic brilliance, the mere existence of a standardized British coinage system tells us something profound about the economic sophistication of Iron Age Britain. You simply do not invent or adopt a complex coinage system unless you possess a society and an economy complex enough to actually require it. The existence of minted gold and silver implies the existence of thriving regional markets. It implies the regular conduct of long-distance trade. It implies complex systems of debt, credit, institutional taxation, political tribute, and high-level diplomatic gift exchange. Operating at a scale too vast and intricate to manage through simple agricultural barter, the tribes of Iron Age Britain who minted these coins were managing economic systems of immense complexity. They were handling agricultural surpluses, coordinating specialist manufacturing, and operating political economies sophisticated enough to demand a standardized, universally recognized medium of exchange. We have written proof of this economic vitality from the classical world itself. The Greek geographer and maritime explorer Pytheas, who sailed his ship from Massalia, modern Marseille, all the way around the treacherous coasts of Britain around 320 BCE, left a detailed account of his journey. Though his original manuscript is lost, it is extensively quoted and paraphrased in later ancient sources. Pytheas describes a Britain of abundant, well-managed grain harvests. He describes massive, highly organized tin mining and trading operations. He speaks of a dense population with established, civilized habits of hospitality and diplomatic protocol toward foreign strangers, and he records extraordinary natural phenomena, including the massive tidal range of the Atlantic coast, which Pytheas seems to have been the very first Greek scientific observer to correctly connect to the gravitational influence of the moon. Knowledge he likely acquired from the local Britons, whose megaliths had been tracking that moon for thousands of years. The Britain that Pytheas describes to the Greek world is absolutely not a miserable, frozen land of naked, blue-painted savages scratching desperately at the dirt. It is a land of organized, surplus-producing agriculture. It is a nation with established, secure trade routes, codified social customs governing the treatment of international visitors, and a coastal population sufficiently engaged with the Mediterranean world to be entirely familiar with the presence of Greek merchants. The fact that Pytheas was able to successfully navigate the incredibly dangerous reef-strewn waters around Britain means he found local mariners who could guide him. It means the coastal populations possessed sophisticated navigational knowledge and were willing to share it with a foreign explorer. The tin traders who connected the deep mines of Cornwall to the wealthy markets of the Phoenician and Greek worlds were participating in a much larger, incredibly ancient pattern of long-distance maritime exchange. This network made Britain not a peripheral, forgotten backwater, but a highly significant, beating heart in the trading networks of the ancient Atlantic world. We call this the Atlantic Facade. From the coasts of Morocco and North Africa, up through the Iberian Peninsula, past the shores of Brittany, encompassing all of Britain and Ireland, and reaching all the way to the frozen fjords of Norway, the western edge of Europe was connected by sea routes that predate the Roman period by thousands of years. The archaeological evidence for this is irrefutable. British Bronze Age metalwork has been excavated in France, in Spain, and in Scandinavia. Heavy golden jewelry, forged from Irish gold, was distributed across Britain and deep into continental Europe. Scandinavian amber is routinely found in British graves. Exotic Mediterranean faience beads reached the shores of Britain in the early Bronze Age, proving that deep maritime connections stretched as far as the eastern Mediterranean, long before the first historically documented Greek or Phoenician trading expeditions ever set sail. Britain was never isolated on the edge of the ancient world. It stood proudly at the western terminus of one of the most dynamic, active, and culturally rich maritime trading zones in the prehistoric Atlantic. The knowledge, the precious materials, and the radical new ideas that flowed along these ancient sea routes shaped British culture at every single stage of its development, from the Neolithic monument builders straight through to the Iron Age Celts. And crucially, the influence flowed in both directions. British theological ideas, British metallurgical innovations, and British people moved outward along those exact same sea lanes, profoundly influencing the continental cultures they encountered. So, what happened to all of this magnificent complexity, this deeply rooted interconnected civilization, after the Roman military machine finally broke through? The answer is incredibly complex, historically tragic, yet in some profound ways, deeply encouraging. The Roman conquest of Britain formally commenced under Emperor Claudius in 43 CE and pushed progressively northward over the following decades of extreme bloodshed, did not utterly destroy the civilization it encountered. Instead, it overlaid it. It transformed the surface, while the deep roots remained embedded in the soil. The tribal aristocracies of Britain, those who survived the legions, were systematically incorporated into the Roman administrative machine. Their Celtic chieftains were given togas and gradually became Roman citizens. Their sprawling, chaotic hillforts were abandoned, and their populations were moved down into the valleys, where their settlements were overlaid with rigid Roman grid plans, stone forums, public baths, and classical temples. But their native languages did not disappear. The Latin that spread across Roman Britain as the language of military administration and elite commerce was always utilized alongside, rather than simply replacing, the native Celtic languages of the general population. The ancient sacred sites of the Britons were largely co-opted rather than demolished. The local deities of the rivers and the springs were merged with Roman counterparts in a calculated psychological process known as interpretatio Romana. This was an imperial strategy that simultaneously acknowledged the undeniable, lingering power of the local British traditions, while desperately attempting to reframe them safely within manageable Roman theological categories. But the megalithic monuments, the great stone circles, and the massive earthworks could not be so easily co-opted. They were simply too old, physically too massive, and too deeply embedded in both the landscape and the ancestral memory of the population to be neatly reframed as Roman temples. The Roman engineers built their famous arrow-straight military roads across the island without any reference to the Neolithic sacred landscape. They laid their paving stones across a territory that had already been organized and sanctified by thousands of years of continuous human use. Yet the old centers of the landscape quietly, stubbornly persisted. We know for a fact that people continued to visit Stonehenge throughout the Roman occupation. Roman coins and Romano-British pottery have been excavated from the soil at Stonehenge, proving that it remained a place of intense human activity, likely a site of secretive pilgrimage or continued ritual significance, long after the legions arrived. The colossal earthworks of the Avebury landscape show clear evidence of Roman period activity. Silbury Hill, that massive, inexplicable chalk mound, was so undeniably huge that it was incorporated into the Roman infrastructure. They literally had to curve a major Roman road right around its immense base. They treated it as an immovable, fixed point in the landscape, a geological reality worthy of engineering around, rather than an obstacle they could simply demolish. And in the wild, untamed north, in the rugged highlands of Scotland, far beyond the heavily fortified frontier that eventually stabilized along Hadrian's Wall, the Roman conquest simply failed to take root. The fiercely independent tribes of what is now Scotland successfully maintained their freedom throughout the entire Roman period. And with that hard-won independence, they maintained their ancient cultural and artistic traditions in a much more direct, unbroken, and defiant way than the heavily Romanized South. The enigmatic Pictish culture that would vividly emerge in Scotland during the post-Roman period, famously leaving behind extraordinary standing stones carved with deeply abstract, hypnotic symbols of unknown meaning, likely represents the final, late flowering of a visual tradition that stretches unbroken all the way back to the Neolithic. Those Pictish symbols, the carved crescents, the intricate mirrors, the V-rods, and the complex geometric forms, bear absolutely no connection to any known Roman or classical artistic tradition. They appear in the historical record fully formed, defying all attempts at straightforward modern interpretation. They are the defiant, enduring voice of the indigenous, symbolic tradition of northern Britain, a tradition that had been quietly developing and evolving for 5,000 years before a Roman sandal ever touched the mud of the British Isles. Even within the conquered territories of the South, the population of Roman Britain was never racially, culturally, or psychologically homogeneous. A deeply revealing letter discovered among the Vindolanda tablets, that extraordinary, fragile collection of wooden writing tablets excavated from a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall, provides a shocking glimpse into the Roman psychological state. In one of these letters, a Roman soldier stationed on the freezing frontier refers to the local British people using the term Britunculi. It is a diminutive, deeply condescending, and highly revealing slur. It translates roughly to the wretched little Britons. This specific term is absolutely fascinating. It proves that the Roman military apparatus stationed in Britain saw the indigenous population not as fellow, assimilated Romans who simply happened to live in a northern province, but as a completely distinct, alien, and separate group. The Romans recognized, with deep frustration, that the native Britons possessed their own stubborn characteristics, their own secretive ways, and their own fiercely persistent identity that actively resisted total psychological absorption into the Roman cultural machine. That persistent identity was not derived from Roman laws. It was grounded firmly in the soil. It was anchored in the landscape and in the long, unbroken memory of exactly what that landscape contained. The ancient monuments were still towering over the valleys. The sacred springs were still flowing. The deep oral traditions that connected the living population to the ancient history of those stones were still there, carefully carried in the minds and memories of individuals who had never truly been converted into obedient Roman citizens, and who had absolutely no intention of ever becoming so. The deep history of Britain was never lost when the Romans arrived. It was simply driven underground. It was quietly, brilliantly coded into the forms of a culture that learned to coexist with Roman military administration while fiercely maintaining its own ancient frameworks of meaning in the dark forests, the deep caves, and the high hills, spaces and modes of thought that the rigid Roman system could simply never penetrate. It is profoundly worth pausing here, amidst the ruins and the fading echoes of Roman legions, to ask a fundamental question. Why does any of this matter now? Why should a modern audience care so deeply about a civilization that ended, at least in its most recognizable architectural form, thousands of years ago? Why does it matter that the people who dragged the stones to Avebury and engineered the lintels of Stonehenge were vastly more sophisticated than we were ever taught to believe? And why does the fact that the Roman Empire was secretly disturbed by the undeniable evidence of British antiquity hold any relevance to our present understanding of the world? It matters for one overarching, inescapable reason: the conventional narrative of British history, a narrative that effectively begins with the arrival of the Romans and dismissively treats everything before that moment as a mere primitive prologue, is fundamentally, demonstrably wrong. It is not just slightly inaccurate, it is factually, catastrophically incorrect. The scientific and archaeological evidence required to shatter that old narrative has been accumulating for decades. Yet the old myths stubbornly persist in textbooks and popular consciousness. Accepting this correction means accepting a paradigm shift. It means recognizing that the island of Britain was home to intellectually serious, culturally rich, astronomically knowledgeable, and organizationally capable civilizations for at least as long as the most celebrated ancient cultures of the Mediterranean world. This is no longer a fringe, marginal claim whispered by alternative historians. It is the straightforward, inescapable conclusion drawn from a century of rigorous archaeological work, and it possesses profound implications for how we understand the very origins of the knowledge traditions that underlie modern Western civilization. But it also matters because the specific methods by which the story of pre-Roman Britain was systematically minimized, simplified, and distorted tell us something deeply important about how history is constructed, who gets to construct it, and for what political purposes. The systematic erasure did not actually begin with the Romans. It was perfected much later, during the period of early modern European scholarship, when the foundational frameworks for understanding human history were being constructed from scratch. These 17th, 18th, and 19th century scholars were working with a flawed combination of classical Roman texts, strict biblical chronologies, and the very infancy of what would eventually become the science of archaeology. These scholars were not simply acting as neutral observers reporting on objective evidence. They were actively constructing historical narratives that served specific, immediate cultural and political purposes. The physical evidence of prehistoric Britain presented a massive, uncomfortable problem for those narratives, which drove a systematic reinterpretation of the evidence toward the most primitive possible reading. The Victorian scholars who fully systematized the study of prehistoric Britain operated within a rigid, unyielding framework of assumptions about human progress. Their worldview made it almost cognitively impossible for them to recognize what was sitting right in front of them. The Victorian framework demanded a story of progressive, linear advance from savage primitivism to classical Roman Enlightenment, culminating conveniently in the glory of the British Empire. It was a politically motivated construction that directly served the interests of a society deeply engaged in global empire building. The Victorians desperately needed a historical story about civilization that justified the imperial idea that some peoples inherently needed to be brought civilization from the outside, simply because they were genetically or culturally incapable of developing it themselves. The undeniable physical evidence of the megalithic civilization of Britain sat awkwardly, heavily, and inconveniently within that Victorian framework. It demonstrated clearly in towering stones and massive earthworks that were impossible to dismiss that a non-literate, non-urban, pre-Roman indigenous society had achieved levels of intellectual and organizational sophistication that absolutely destroyed the model of civilizational hierarchy the Victorians relied upon. To resolve this cognitive dissonance, the scholars of the era looked at the extraordinary achievements of the ancient Britons and attributed them to anyone else. They suggested these monuments must have been built by people who were guided by divine intervention, or they pointed to wandering Egyptians, lost Phoenicians, or even the mythical survivors of Atlantis. The idea that indigenous people, the direct biological and cultural descendants of the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who had walked the island for thousands of years, could have developed and sustained a civilization of this magnitude entirely from their own intellectual resources was simply unthinkable. It was an insult to the Victorian worldview. We have to think it now, however, because the modern evidence leaves us no other choice. Even the early antiquarians who tried to understand the monuments inadvertently contributed to the confusion. John Aubrey, the brilliant 17th century English antiquarian, who was the very first to seriously and systematically document both Stonehenge and Avebury, came closer than most of his contemporaries to recognizing their true, staggering significance. Aubrey's unpublished manuscript, Monumenta Britannica, contains observations about the stone circles and massive earthworks that were remarkably perceptive for the 1600s. He rightfully connected them to a pre-Roman tradition of indigenous religious practices and accurately acknowledged the extraordinary, mind-bending scale of the human effort required to construct them. Aubrey possessed an unmatched instinct for reading landscape features. He was the one who identified Avebury as being vastly more significant in scale than Stonehenge, at a time when Stonehenge already hoarded all the cultural prestige. He proposed that the stone circles were temples of the Druids. And while modern radiocarbon dating has shown a massive chronological gap between the original Neolithic monument builders and the later Iron Age Druids, his core intuition that both the stones and the Druids were expressions of the exact same deep, indigenous British tradition was remarkably accurate. William Stukeley, who followed in Aubrey's footsteps in the early 18th century, published the first truly meticulous, detailed descriptions and engravings of both Stonehenge and Avebury. His drawings remain invaluable today, serving as vital records of monuments that were already being heavily damaged by agricultural plowing and local stone robbing. But Stukely also constructed an elaborate, heavily romanticized mythology of the Druids that owed far more to his own vivid imagination and his desperate desire to reconcile prehistoric British ruins with the Christianity of his own time than to any genuine archaeological evidence. Stukely essentially invented the modern pop culture image of the Druid, the benevolent, white-robed philosopher-priest of the oak groves, a mystical sage whose ancient wisdom somehow miraculously anticipated Christian revelation. This highly romanticized, fictionalized image proved so intensely powerful that it saturated popular culture for 2 centuries, and it continues to generate massive confusion about the actual, rigorous, and terrifying nature of the genuine Druidic tradition. The historical damage done by this romanticized Druid image was substantial. By inextricably linking the incredibly ancient megalithic monuments to a fictionalized quasi-Christian version of Iron Age Druidism, Stukely inadvertently made it much easier for subsequent generations of rigid academic scholarship to dismiss both of them entirely. When the true chronological distance between the megalithic monuments and the Iron Age Celts finally became apparent through 19th and 20th century dating methods, scholars used this discrepancy as a weapon. They argued not only that the Druids had nothing to do with building Stonehenge, which is technically correct in a strict constructional sense, but they took it a step further. They argued that the entire tradition of serious British prehistoric culture was essentially a void, an empty space waiting to be filled by external influences from supposedly superior ancient civilizations. But this assumption that civilization only flows outward from the East, from the ancient Near East, through Greece and Rome, and finally trickling northward into the dark forests of barbarian Europe, is a bias deeply embedded in the Western scholarly tradition from its very beginnings. You can trace this geographic arrogance straight back to the classical sources. Herodotus treats Egypt as the ultimate source of all Greek civilization. Greek and Roman historians consistently position the peoples of the Atlantic Northwest as the barbaric, ignorant periphery of a world whose only true center of gravity is the Mediterranean Sea. The Celts, whenever they appear in classical texts, are described with a toxic mixture of exotic fascination and deep imperial contempt. They are cast as noble savages, admirable perhaps in their raw physical courage and their wild love of freedom, but tragically lacking the intellectual reason, the architectural discipline, and the scientific rigor that the classical tradition exclusively associated with true civilization. Britain, being an island at the extreme edge of the known world, was therefore supposed to be the most primitive, the most backward, and the least civilized of all. To discover, in monument after massive monument, in landscape after painstakingly engineered landscape, that this supposedly peripheral island was actually home to one of the most ancient, mathematically precise, and astronomically sophisticated cultures on, was simply not accommodatable within the classical or Victorian framework without forcing a total, humiliating revision of world history. We are finally, right now, in the glorious process of that fundamental revision, and the scientific tools we possess today to carry it out are incomparably superior to anything available to previous generations of scholars. The most revolutionary of these tools is LiDAR technology. Standing for light detection and ranging, LiDAR utilizes millions of rapid laser pulses fired from low-flying aircraft to map the ground below. It penetrates dense tree cover, thick vegetation, and centuries of topsoil to create extraordinarily detailed, three-dimensional digital maps of the bare Earth's surface. Since its widespread application to British landscape archaeology in the early years of the 21st century, LiDAR has completely and permanently transformed our knowledge of the prehistoric world. Features that were previously completely unknown, totally invisible to a person standing on the ground, and undetectable even from conventional aerial photography, have emerged in their absolute hundreds from LiDAR surveys across the British Isles. We are finding entirely new monuments, previously undocumented field systems, complex settlement patterns, and intricate landscape relationships between known monuments that were impossible to comprehend when you could only examine isolated fragments of the landscape at a time. The Stonehenge landscape, as revealed by extensive LiDAR surveys over the past decade, is incomparably richer, denser, and more astonishing than the Stonehenge landscape as it was understood even 20 years ago. A massive LiDAR survey of the area surrounding Stonehenge, officially published in 2014, revealed over 60 previously unknown monuments hidden directly in the vicinity of the famous stones. This included a massive curving timber structure that archaeologists believe may have served as a sprawling stadium or a grand viewing platform for massive ritual events connected to the central monument. But perhaps the most staggering revelation brought to light by modern surveying and subsequent excavation is the Durrington Walls complex. Located a mere 3 kilometers from Stonehenge, Durrington Walls is a massive henge enclosure. Modern archaeology has revealed it to be vastly more extensive, densely populated, and socially complex than anyone had ever previously dared to guess. The sprawling settlement associated with Durrington Walls dates precisely to around 2500 BCE. This makes it exactly contemporaneous with the massive Sarsen stone construction phase of Stonehenge. It is now universally recognized by archaeologists as the largest known settlement in all of Neolithic Britain, potentially housing thousands upon thousands of people during the peak construction seasons of the Great Monument. We must discard the old image of scattered, isolated farming communities, individually contributing a few days of labor to a local temple. Durrington Walls proves we are looking at massive, highly organized communities coming together in a deliberate, centrally planned, incredibly sustained cooperative effort of a scale that rivals the construction of the Egyptian pyramids. The specific evidence regarding the construction seasons at Durrington Walls is particularly revealing of their societal sophistication. Detailed dental analysis of the tens of thousands of animal bones excavated from the settlement's massive refuse pits shows something incredible. The cattle and pigs being consumed in vast quantities were almost exclusively being slaughtered in the deep midwinter. But it gets more astonishing. Strontium isotope analysis, a technique that measures chemical signatures absorbed from local groundwater into tooth enamel during an animal's infancy, shows that these cattle and pigs were not raised locally on the chalk downs of Wiltshire. They had been grazed in entirely different, distinct geological regions across the length and breadth of Britain, and then driven alive over hundreds of miles, brought specifically to Durrington Walls for massive coordinated slaughter and communal winter feasting. This paints a picture of a deliberate, meticulously planned, and logistically staggering assembly. Animals were being transported from across an entire landmass to a central location, just to feed a massive workforce during the darkest, coldest months of the year. The immense organizational infrastructure required to plan this is mind-boggling. To coordinate the breeding, collection, and cross-country transport of thousands of animals, to house and feed thousands of human workers through a freezing Neolithic winter, and to simultaneously direct their intensive labor in the precision architectural construction of a monument like Stonehenge. This is absolutely not the infrastructure of a primitive, decentralized agrarian society. It is the undeniable infrastructure of a sophisticated state level, or at the absolute minimum, a highly advanced chiefdom level, political organization. It demonstrates a central authority possessing the vast capacity to command resources, mobilize supply chains, and seamlessly coordinate human labor across a massive geographic area. And the isotopic analysis of human remains excavated from the area around Stonehenge tells the exact same story of vast, island-wide integration. The individuals buried in the immediate vicinity of Stonehenge during its main construction period show an incredibly wide geographic spread of origins. The chemical signatures in their teeth reflect the distinct geologies of regions far beyond the local chalk of Wiltshire. People traveled from the deep valleys of Wales, from the rugged north of England, from the highlands of Scotland, and from the distant shores of Cornwall in the southwest, all to participate in this great architectural project. This was not an accidental gathering of wandering tribes. This was a highly formalized pilgrimage. It was a deliberately organized mobilization of humanity from across the entire island, uniting around a singular project of such profound cultural, astronomical, and religious significance that it entirely overrode local tribal divisions and regional differences in identity. The people who journeyed to Stonehenge to sweat, bleed, and work on its construction did not all come from the same tribe. They almost certainly did not speak the same dialects. They may not have even understood the theological nuances of the project in exactly the same terms. But they came, they cooperated, and they built. The sheer complexity of Stonehenge as a pure engineering project is worth dwelling on, because it is still vastly underappreciated in popular historical accounts. The mighty Sarsen stones, the massive ultra-hard sandstone blocks that form the iconic central trilithons in the Great Outer Circle, were transported from the Marlborough Downs, located roughly 25 miles to the north. But they did not travel in a straight line. The stones had to be carefully dragged around treacherous geological obstacles, hauled across flowing rivers, and navigated through a landscape of considerable topographical difficulty. Keep in mind, the largest of these upright stones weighs an astonishing 25 tons. Moving a single 25-ton stone utilizing only Neolithic technology, wooden sledges, rolling logs, and braided natural fiber ropes, requires a highly coordinated labor force of potentially several hundred people pulling in absolute unison. It requires precise, shouted commands and expert direction to prevent the colossal stone from veering off course, sinking into the mud, or instantly crushing the workers who were desperately managing its momentum. Once the stones arrived, the finishing process was itself an extraordinary technical achievement that defies belief. The surfaces of these massive sarsen stones were not left rough. They were meticulously dressed and smoothed. This was achieved using heavy handheld hammerstones, essentially pounding away the rough natural outer surface of the incredibly dense sandstone over massive surface areas, until the stone face was uniformly flat. The colossal stone lintels, the horizontal blocks resting on top of the uprights, were painstakingly shaped with deliberate, calculated curves on their outer faces. This was done so that they perfectly matched the exact curvature of the circle they were forming. The result was that the outer face of the completed stone ring was a perfect, continuous arc, rather than a jagged series of flat-faced, disjointed segments. This is extreme precision work executed at a monumental scale. It requires the kind of advanced geometric understanding that allows a master craftsman to calculate exactly how much material to pound away from each millimeter of a lintel face to produce a specific, continuous curve once that lintel is hoisted 20 feet into the air. And then there is the joinery. The lintels were locked to the tops of the uprights using massive mortise and tenon joints, protruding stone pegs fitting perfectly into carved stone holes. The adjacent lintels were then locked to each other using complex tongue and groove joints. This required the matching of deeply carved structural features across massive, uneven stone surfaces with tolerances so tight that, given the crushing weight of the stones involved, there was absolutely zero margin for error. If the carved tenon was off by half an inch, the 10-ton lintel would not sit flat, and the entire structure would be compromised. Who taught these Neolithic people how to do this? This is the very question that the conventional, linear historical narrative simply cannot answer. Within their flawed framework, there is no predecessor tradition advanced enough to have passed these complex architectural techniques onto the ancient Britons. The true answer, which the modern evidence overwhelmingly supports, is that this tradition of precision stonework evolved organically in Britain itself. It grew directly out of the long, deep experience with megalithic construction that began thousands of years earlier in the Neolithic, starting with the careful shaping of orthostats for the ancient long barrows and passage graves. The people who built Stonehenge were absolutely not inventing precision stonework from scratch. They were the proud heirs of a native tradition, of working with massive stones that had been developing, refining, and perfecting itself in Britain and Ireland for over 1,000 years before the Sarsen phase of Stonehenge was even conceived. This precision represents not the sudden arrival of an external, foreign technique, but the magnificent culmination of a long, purely indigenous trajectory of technological and intellectual development. We can see this developmental trajectory beautifully illustrated by looking across the sea to Newgrange in Ireland. While technically outside the island of Britain, Newgrange is fundamentally part of the exact same Atlantic megalithic tradition and cannot be left out of any comprehensive account of this civilization. Newgrange is a colossal passage tomb built around 3200 BCE, making it centuries older than both Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Giza. It sits on a prominent ridge above the River Boyne in County Meath. It consists of a massive circular mound covering a perfectly straight 19-meter stone passage that leads to a complex cruciform inner chamber, all constructed from massive stone slabs. The inner chamber features a spectacular corbelled roof. In this architectural masterpiece, large, flat stones are laid in successive courses, projecting progressively inward until they meet at the very top. This magnificent vault has remained completely waterproof and structurally sound for over 5,000 years, despite utilizing absolutely no mortar or jointing material whatsoever. The engineering precision required to balance those projecting courses and calculate the exact inward angle required to safely close the vault is staggering. But the true genius of Newgrange lies in its relationship with the sky. At the winter solstice, for about 17 days around the shortest, darkest day of the year, the light of the rising sun enters Newgrange. It does not enter through the main door, but through a highly specialized, precisely engineered roof box located directly above the entrance. The beam of golden light travels exactly down the 19-meter passage to dramatically illuminate the floor of the inner chamber for precisely 17 minutes. This light box is not a structural accident. It is a precisely engineered, mathematical feature designed entirely to capture the light of the rising sun on the exact days of the winter solstice. To build it, the megalithic engineers had to know, years in advance, exactly where the rising sun would appear on the distant horizon at the solstice, calculated for the exact latitude of the monument, and calibrated to the exact height of the roof box above the rising floor of the inner passage. They had to know this with such flawless precision that they could set the angle of the roof box correctly before the massive mound was piled on top of it. Because once the thousands of tons of earth and stone were in place, there was absolutely no way to adjust the alignment. This required, at a bare minimum, years or decades of prior, meticulous celestial observation at that exact site to establish the precise bearing of the solstice sunrise. It then required an advanced method for translating that abstract observed bearing into a physical, architectural specification. This is the exact same tradition that later produced Stonehenge. The profound astronomical knowledge encoded into Newgrange in 3200 BCE is the exact same tradition of observation and architectural expression that produced the even more complex, technically demanding astronomical alignments of Stonehenge built over the following centuries. It is an indigenous tradition developed entirely within the Atlantic megalithic world, reaching a level of breathtaking sophistication long before any influence from the literate civilizations of the ancient Near East could have ever plausibly reached the British Isles. The revolutionary discovery in the 1970s and 80s that Stonehenge might have actually functioned as a colossal Neolithic computer capable of predicting complex solar and lunar eclipses through the careful placement and systematic movement of markers within the monument is famously associated with the work of astronomer Alexander Thom and engineer Fred Hoyle. While the idea of Stonehenge as an exact eclipse predictor remains heavily debated in academic circles, what is absolutely no longer controversial is that Stonehenge is precisely, deliberately oriented to major solar and lunar events. Whether the monument functioned as a complex predictive calculator or simply as an incredibly precise architectural marker of the solstices and the 18.6-year lunar standstills, the pure mathematical and engineering sophistication required to produce and maintain these alignments is undeniable. The people who built and utilized Stonehenge possessed a systematic, detailed, and generational knowledge of astronomical cycles. They expressed that scientific knowledge in architecture of extraordinary technical precision. The renowned archaeoastronomer Clive Ruggles, who has spent decades meticulously studying the astronomical alignments of megalithic monuments across Britain and Ireland, has concluded that the evidence for intentional astronomical orientation is irrefutable and widespread. But crucially, he argues that the function of these orientations was deeply symbolic and ritualistic, rather than purely scientific in the cold modern sense of the word. This distinction is vital for understanding who these people were. They were not building modern observatories just to collect abstract data. They were building places of profound meaning. They were constructing physical interfaces where the relationship between the fragile human community and the terrifying, majestic cosmic order was expressed, celebrated, and spiritually renewed. The astronomical alignments were the physical manifestation of a worldview in which the movements of the sun and the moon were not just distant natural phenomena, but active living aspects of a sacred cosmic order. It was an order that human communities had a deep, existential obligation to acknowledge and engage with. The knowledge required to produce those alignments was unequivocally scientific. It required sustained observation, advanced pattern recognition, complex mathematical reasoning, and expert structural engineering. But the ultimate purpose to which that scientific knowledge was put was never separate from the ritual, spiritual, and artistic life of the community. It was completely, beautifully integral to it. This seamless integration of what we in the modern world would rigidly separate into science, religion, art, and engineering is perhaps the most profound and interesting aspect of the megalithic civilization of Britain. The flawless astronomical precision of the monuments, the abstract, symbolic art that decorates their stones, and the intense ritual practices centered within them were not separate, compartmentalized domains assigned to different academic departments. They were unified aspects of a single, integrated engagement with the universe. And every single stone placed, every ditch dug, and every lintel carved served the same fundamental purpose: maintaining the sacred relationship between the human community and the magnificent, turning order of the cosmos of which it was an essential part. The Druidic tradition that preserved and transmitted this profound integration in the Iron Age was absolutely not distorting an originally purely scientific tradition by lazily adding religious content. It was actively, deliberately maintaining the original, holistic integration that had characterized the megalithic tradition from its very beginning.
And this integration is precisely what made the indigenous British tradition so incredibly resistant to Roman penetration and imperial assimilation. The Romans were absolute experts at compartmentalizing knowledge. They ruthlessly separated law from religion, structural engineering from natural philosophy, and military organization from cultural practice. They established dedicated specialists for each domain, and built rigid administrative structures that kept those domains separate, predictable, and manageable.
But the British tradition defied this categorization. In Britain, the exact same body of knowledge encompassed observational astronomy, landscape reading, ritual practice, philosophical reasoning, legal memory, and deep historical tradition. The specialists who held that vast body of knowledge were simultaneously astronomers, priests, judges, historians, and natural philosophers.
Because it was not organized in a way that the Roman administrative mind could easily map, understand, or systematically undermine, the Romans simply could not co-opt it. To destroy a system where the library exists exclusively inside the minds of the people, you have to destroy the people who hold it in their bodies.
And that is precisely what the Romans ultimately tried to do at the massacre of Anglesey in 60 CE. But they did not succeed completely. The evidence for the stubborn persistence of indigenous British cultural traditions, straight through the Roman period, and long beyond it, is utterly substantial.
The survival of Celtic languages in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland through to the present day is the most obvious example. But the persistence of sacred sites is perhaps even more revealing. Across the island, we find continuously venerated locations, holy wells, high hilltops, and specific landscape features associated with supernatural beings that survived every single political, military, and demographic change on the island.
Take the magnificent thermal springs at Bath. In the Celtic period, this site was dedicated to the goddess Sulis, but it was actively venerated as a sacred site long before any Celtic presence in Britain. The deposits of votive objects discovered at the bottom of the hot spring date straight back to the Bronze Age, and possibly much earlier, demonstrating a continuous, unbroken tradition of sacred practice at the exact same location, stretching back thousands of years.
Characteristically, the Romans did not destroy this location. Instead, they built a massive classical temple complex right over it, dedicating it to Sulis Minerva, desperately attempting to co-opt the local deity by identifying her with a Roman one. But the ancient, indigenous practice of throwing votive offerings into the dark water of the spring continued straight through the Roman period, with remarkable continuity.
This is a pattern entirely visible across the whole of Roman Britain. The landscape of prehistoric Britain was never a blank slate onto which successive conquering cultures simply projected their own independent meanings. It was a palimpsest, a magnificent, living document written and rewritten over thousands of years, in which each new layer of meaning was inscribed over and partly through the existing ones.
The Romans wrote their imperial layer on top of what the Celts had written. The Celts had written on top of what the Bronze Age people had written, which was placed directly on top of what the Neolithic megalith builders had originally inscribed. But that earliest layer, the deepest and most profound inscription, remained legible beneath all the others, expressed in the sheer physical fabric of monuments that were simply too massive and too numerous to demolish.
Furthermore, the figures of the Irish and Welsh mythological traditions, miraculously preserved in illuminated manuscripts from the medieval period, contain narrative elements and cosmological concepts that specialists in comparative mythology have forcefully argued derive from a pre-Celtic stratum of belief reaching all the way back to the Neolithic.
The recurring motifs of the triple goddess, the sacrifice sacred king, the magical cauldron of rebirth, the world tree, and the sacred grove. These are not the sudden innovations of the Iron Age Celts. They are deep inheritances from vastly older traditions, filtered through a Celtic cultural form, but originating deep in the ancient stratum of the Atlantic, Neolithic, and Bronze Age world.
We see this exact same continuity in the chalk figure tradition of southern England. Figures cut directly into the white chalk downland, including the stunning Uffington White Horse in Oxfordshire, the Cerne Abbas Giant in Dorset, and the Long Man of Wilmington in East Sussex, have been associated with prehistoric origins since the earliest days of antiquarian investigation.
The Uffington White Horse is the most certainly ancient of these. Recently dated by optically stimulated luminescence to around 1000 BCE, it was carved deep in the late Bronze Age. Its highly stylized, dynamic, sweeping form bears a much closer relationship to the abstract horse images found on contemporary Bronze Age metalwork than to any kind of realistic biological representation.
The very act of cutting and maintaining massive figures in the chalk downland is an act of landscape inscription. It is the act of writing immense meaning directly onto the physical world in a form visible from a great distance. This is entirely, philosophically consistent with the monumental tradition of the megalithic civilization.
You do not simply cut a massive chalk figure into a hillside and leave it. You have to actively maintain it. You must return regularly, year after year, generation after generation, to clear the encroaching vegetation, scour the trenches, and restore the blinding white chalk surface. The maintenance of a chalk figure across dozens of generations requires organized, communal effort and a continuous cultural tradition attributing immense significance to the figure, sufficient to motivate that exhausting manual labor.
The entire tradition of landscape inscription that defines British prehistoric culture, the long barrows, fortified hill forts, the towering stone circles, the sprawling cursus monuments, the chalk figures, the river deposits of votive objects, is a single, massive, continuous tradition of treating the landscape as a communicative medium.
It is a sophisticated cultural strategy for maintaining communal identity and collective memory across unimaginable time spans. They used the landscape itself as the medium of transmission precisely because the landscape is infinitely more durable than parchment, papyrus, or any other medium available to a pre-literate society.
To truly comprehend this, we must look to the groundbreaking work of archaeologist Christopher Tilley, whose championing of phenomenological archaeology in the 1990s revolutionized how we view these spaces. Tilley successfully argued that the monuments of prehistoric Britain, properly understood in the context of the physical, bodily landscape experience they were deliberately designed to produce.
The long barrows of the Cotswolds, for example, are not just dropped randomly on hillsides. They are aligned in highly specific ways that produce calculated visual relationships with the surrounding hills, valleys, and rivers when you approach them from the directions that ancient ritual practice almost certainly dictated.
The experience of physically moving through the landscape toward a monument, of arriving at a specific engineered vantage point from which the megalith suddenly, dramatically comes into view against a particular skyline, of actually entering the stone chamber and experiencing the deliberate spatial manipulation of light, shadow, and acoustics that its architecture creates. All of this was integral to the meaning of the monument.
This meaning cannot be recovered from reading two-dimensional excavation reports or looking at aerial photographs. It has to be walked, it has to be felt.
This kind of phenomenological understanding, this reading of the landscape as an intentional, experiential, communicative system, is deeply, profoundly compatible with the Druidic tradition of knowledge transmission. The 20 years of oral learning that a Druid underwent was not abstract, detached book learning.
It was the embodied, physical acquisition of a comprehensive framework for understanding the relationship between human life and the natural world. It was expressed through tracking the physical movement of celestial bodies, observing the cyclical behavior of plants and animals, and memorizing the deeply embedded stories connected to specific sacred places.
It was, in the most literal, absolute sense, the kind of knowledge that simply cannot be written down because it is not propositional. It is experiential. It lives in the body of the person who has acquired it, and it dies with them unless it is actively transmitted to another body through the exact same grueling process of experiential learning.
This is precisely the kind of knowledge that writing destroys. The Roman historian who noted that the Druids refused to commit their learning to writing and arrogantly speculated that this was simply because they did not want their knowledge to become common property was completely missing the point.
The Druids refused to write their knowledge down because writing it down would have killed it. The knowledge only existed in its living, embodied, practiced form, a written textual account of how to read a sacred landscape the way a highly trained Druid read it would be exactly like reading a manual on how to ride a bicycle. Technically accurate, perhaps, but utterly useless as a substitute for the actual physical experience.
The Roman literate tradition could not comprehend a form of knowledge that was not, at least in principle, reducible to text. And because it could not comprehend it, it could not preserve it. By systematically suppressing the Druidic institution, Rome contributed heavily to the loss of this ancient, embodied science.
Yet the medieval period inherited this heavily inscribed landscape and its embedded meanings. The process by which those ancient meanings were reinterpreted through a Christian framework is one of the most fascinating chapters in the long history of Britain.
When Christian missionaries arrived in Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries CE, they found a landscape entirely saturated with sacred significance. Every spring, every commanding hill, every ancient monument was already embedded in an ancient unbreakable web of story and practice.
The early church's response, guided by pragmatic directives from figures like Pope Gregory the Great, was not to destroy this web, but to convert it. They sought to rename the sacred places, to replace the old pagan stories with new Christian ones, to plant churches directly at the sites of pre-Christian sanctity, and to dedicate them to saints whose feast days conveniently coincided with the ancient seasonal festivals.
The result was absolutely not the erasure of the pre-Christian landscape, but its deliberate Christianization. Many of the holy wells and sacred springs of Britain and Ireland that became major, wealthy pilgrimage destinations in the medieval period are demonstrably ancient sacred sites, their sanctity predating the Christian period is by thousands of years.
The medieval pilgrims who traveled for weeks to visit these places were unwittingly participating in a tradition of place veneration that their remote Neolithic ancestors had practiced, albeit in forms they would not have recognized. But they went to the exact same places for the exact same fundamental reason: the enduring, unshakable sense that certain locations in the landscape are charged with a significance that exceeds the ordinary.
They intuitively understood that these specific coordinates on the Earth are points of contact with the human world and some other, higher order of reality, and that visiting them and performing the appropriate acts of physical acknowledgement constitutes an important, timeless human obligation.
But there is another body of evidence that receives far less popular attention than the grand stone monuments, yet is in many ways equally significant for truly understanding the sheer capacity of the civilization that produced them. I am talking about the staggering evidence of everyday life, agricultural engineering, and environmental mastery in prehistoric Britain.
The settlements, the sprawling field systems, the domestic crafts, and the regional patterns of exchange reveal a world of highly organized, functioning communities possessing incredibly sophisticated strategies for managing their landscapes. This bears absolutely zero resemblance to the primitive, hand-to-mouth subsistence world that the older historical narrative assumed.
The field systems of prehistoric Britain are an extraordinary case in point. Across the upland areas of Britain, where subsequent intensive agricultural activity has thankfully not plowed them away, the vast, sweeping outlines of Bronze Age and Neolithic field systems survive in the landscape.
Visible from the air or from opposing hillsides, they appear as vast geometric patterns of low banks and ditches marking the boundaries of ancient cultivation. The most extensive and perfectly preserved of these systems are found on Dartmoor in Devon, where a staggering landscape of reeves, low stone walls that once divided the moorland into meticulously organized territories, covers an area of over 100 square kilometers.
The Dartmoor reeve system was not built piecemeal by wandering farmers. It was laid out in a coherent, centrally planned way, with long, perfectly parallel boundaries running straight across the landscape for miles, and shorter cross boundaries precisely dividing the long strips into individual plots.
This is not haphazard subsistence farming. This is organized, state-level land management on a massive territorial scale. It undeniably implies the existence of a central authority capable of surveying a landscape, coordinating land division across a massive area, and enforcing the resulting boundaries over multiple generations.
Dating to the Bronze Age around 5500 to 1200 BCE, the Dartmoor reeves represent the fossilized outline of a landscape that was systematically, scientifically organized for maximum agricultural and pastoral yield across an entire geographic region.
The people who laid it out were participating in a system of territorial organization that required coordination at a level far above the individual household and far above even the individual settlement. It required a level of governance that encompassed the macroscopic management of a large portion of an entire upland region.
And we see this exact same environmental mastery in the complex water management evidence from prehistoric Britain. The wetland areas of the island, particularly the sprawling Somerset levels and the East Anglian fens, were absolutely not avoided by prehistoric communities as inhospitable, dangerous terrain.
They were actively, brilliantly engineered for the vast resources they provided. The Sweet Track in Somerset, a raised, perfectly engineered wooden walkway built across the treacherous waterlogged surface of the Somerset levels, dates to exactly 3806 BCE. It is one of the earliest, most sophisticated examples of complex wooden engineering anywhere in Europe.
It was built using a highly specific combination of timber species, featuring a sturdy base of heavy wooden poles driven deep into the waterlogged peat, with a perfectly leveled planked walkway laid on top. This technique required advanced carpentry skill, an intimate knowledge of the hydrological behavior of the wetland, and absolute mastery of the local timber ecology.
It also required immense logistical planning across a substantial physical distance, as the track runs straight as an arrow for nearly 2 kilometers across the dangerous marsh, coordinating the massive supply of timber, organizing the intense labor of construction, and managing the logistics of working in a sinking, waterlogged environment implies an organizational capacity that shatters our illusions of Neolithic simplicity.
This same wetland mastery produced the magnificent Glastonbury Lake Village in the late Bronze Age and Iron Age. This was a thriving community of perhaps 150 people living comfortably on a massive, artificial island platform of timber, brushwood, and clay, built directly out over the shallow water of a lake.
The construction and continuous maintenance of such a settlement in a wetland environment is a major ongoing engineering undertaking. It required continuous, dedicated attention to the structural stability and waterproofing of the platform, the management of the rising and falling water levels around it, and the constant supply of heavy building materials from the dry land surrounding the marsh.
The diversity of environments successfully settled, engineered, and sustainably managed by prehistoric British communities reflects a depth of environmental knowledge and a brilliant flexibility of technological response that we should find genuinely awe-inspiring.
From the rolling chalk downlands of the south to the harsh granite uplands of Dartmoor, from the engineered wetlands of the Somerset Levels to the freezing, wind-blasted northern islands of Orkney and Shetland, prehistoric Britain developed highly specific, brilliantly detailed strategies for managing the resources of each unique environment.
They passed those strategies down through generations via unbroken oral traditions, refining them constantly in direct dialogue with the environment itself. The result was not a single, uniform, monotonous prehistoric culture, but a glorious, vibrant mosaic of local and regional adaptations, deeply connected by shared traditions of belief, practice, and exchange.
The Romans who arrived in the 1st century BCE were not entering a wild, unmanaged wilderness. They were entering a landscape that had been comprehensively known, expertly surveyed, and carefully managed for millennia before they ever arrived. Their famous roads and towns were simply a different system of order, superimposed on an existing one that was, in many respects, much more finely calibrated to the specific conditions of the British landscape than anything the Romans brought with them.
The long history of Britain before the Romans, before the Celts, before the Bell Beaker migrants, and before the Neolithic farmers is absolutely not a story of progressive linear development from primitive ignorance to civilized enlightenment.
It is a story of continuous, sophisticated, deeply intelligent human engagement with a specific place over an extraordinarily long span of time. The colossal monuments that this engagement produced, the precise astronomical knowledge it preserved, the vast environmental understanding it accumulated, and the complex cultural forms it generated are the ultimate legacy of a civilization that was in every important sense mature, complex, and deeply impressive when Rome was still a collection of mud huts on the banks of the Tiber.
And they built it right here, on this island, with their own hands, their own minds, and their own accumulated knowledge. They did it without help from the Near East, without guidance from mythical lost continents, and without the intervention of any force more mysterious than the extraordinary, boundless capacity of human beings. Given enough time, enough stability, and enough collective will to completely understand their world and express that understanding in forms of lasting, monumental power.
That is the true story of the civilization that terrified the Romans. That is the story of what was actually in Britain long before the legions came. And that is the story that the towering stones on the plain, the massive earthworks on the downs, the carved chambers in the hills, and the precise astronomical alignments on the moors are still telling to anyone who takes the time to stop, look, and listen.
Every single time a new excavation opens in Britain, every time a new LiDAR survey processes its digital data, every time a new set of ancient DNA results comes back from a laboratory, the picture of what was here before the Romans grows richer, more detailed, and more astonishing.
We are nowhere near the end of this story. We are barely past its beginning in terms of what the earth has yet to yield. The sites that have been excavated represent only a tiny, microscopic fraction of the total. Much of the future of prehistoric British archaeology lies in the sites that have not yet been touched, waiting patiently in the soil for the questions we have not yet learned to ask.
What we can say with absolute confidence is this. Before the Romans, before the Celts, before everyone we think of as ancient, there were people here. They built things meant to last, and they did last. They built an intellectual tradition capable of sustaining mathematical calculation and astronomical observation across millennia.
And when the Romans came, the most powerful, arrogant military civilization the Western world had ever produced, they looked at what the ancient people of Britain had built, and they felt a profound vertigo. It was the vertigo of encountering deep time. It was the terrifying recognition that the people they were claiming to civilize had been thinking seriously about the cosmos for far longer than Rome had even existed.
The stones are still there. The earthworks are still there. The alignments with the winter solstice sunset and the summer solstice sunrise are still mathematically flawless. The landscape still reads, to anyone willing to learn its silent language, as a text of extraordinary depth, brilliance, and richness.
The people who wrote that text were not primitive. They were not barbarians awaiting the gift of civilization from the outside. They were the brilliant inheritors and developers of a tradition of human intellectual achievement as old as farming itself.
They were worthy of the awe the Romans felt, but could not bring themselves to acknowledge. Their legacy is dormant in the landscape, waiting to be read, and reading it is one of the most rewarding intellectual projects of our time. They were here, they were extraordinary, and the stones they left us are still standing.